Hey, welcome to the channel. My name is Jason, and here I talk about all things story. And the story we are talking about today is one of my own. Yes, it is episode 28 of my ongoing series, Worth 1,000 Words, where I write a 1,000 word short story based on a piece of artwork without an outline. Don't forget that. And today I went back to a genre that I haven't explored in some time, and that is Western. I feel like you can argue this is kind of a noir vibe as well, something like No Country for Old Men, or in that vein anyway, or even something like True Detective. Both kinds of stories I feel like fit in the same realm, and I'm a massive fan of. And writing this way is extremely fun, and I don't know why I don't do it more often. Maybe this is the genre I should be writing in. I have no idea. Or maybe it's because I don't dip my toes into it enough, and so I don't get bored with it. So what is the soundtrack of today's story? Well, it is a soundtrack. It is titled Waves, and it is by two gentlemen, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. I'm sure you've heard of them. They have successfully made a new career as film composers, and I couldn't be happier. I've always loved Trent's music, and seeing him get into the film industry has been a really interesting experiment. I know with his Ghosts album, he was experimenting with more of that subdued instrumental music that could be a soundtrack in itself. And with all the films like The Social Network, even something like Mank, which he did by David Fincher, completely orchestrated, completely out of character. And it's just interesting to me how David Fincher chose him to orchestrate something like that. Or I should say, these two men. But anyway, I didn't go to Cliff Martinez, even though I was tempted because I feel like his music really would have fit the tone of this piece. This one worked beautifully. Highly recommend it. It's a great listen. It was actually the first time I listened to it. I had no idea they did the music for this movie. So put some headphones on, have a listen, and let's see this week's artwork. This week's artwork is titled Night Hunt, and it's by Davison Carvalho, who is the head of UI and lead concept artist at Amazon Studios. What really stood out to me in this one is the graphic nature of it. It's very blocky in tone. It's got literal halftones coming up from the fire and the smoke, and just has an overall interesting vibe to it. We have a man who's just burning, or I guess could be a woman, burning in the fire in the background. We have a man in the foreground who his back is to the display, as if maybe he can't stand to look at it. But off in the distance, off to the side, there is another one, and he seems to be quite pleased with what's going on. This one has a very noir feeling to it, and I have a feeling that's going to be apparent with the words I choose. These ones are really fun. I feel like just the way you write noir fiction, it just has that gritty, simplistic tone to it. I don't know a better way to describe it, but Davison, thank you for the artwork. I really love what you did here with the graphical style and the minimalism of it. And it really just goes to show you that you don't need to have a ton of detail to really convey a mood and atmosphere. And I'd even argue that less is more in this case. All right, let's see what I came up with. The squad car lights lasered the roaring fragment of hell that coughed half-tone smoke into a dead sky. Deputy Madison Clement had never thought such poetry. The letters that made words that made sounds seeped through his jacket that still smelled of Barnes's cheap cologne. Jeannie would smell it when he got home. Through the smoke, through the dirt, through the screams. The dirt at his feet parted for him, as if sand buffeted by an ocean breeze. He was far from any ocean. He stopped because he couldn't stand the sound of it, the dirt. He wanted to hear what he should be hearing, but for some reason, the sorry bastard had gone silent once they'd left the car. Resigned to what was to come, Clement supposed. Like a fucking hero. Like a fucking hero, Clement said. It tasted like a shot of shoehorn whiskey, and shoehorn whiskey tasted like shit. If he kept walking, he'd make it to the tree line, where the trees would overshadow what he had left behind with their shadows. Night shadows were the darkest, cut from the reflection of something far hotter than the blaze that consumed the silent hero. God damn it, Clement needed to stop calling him that. But Clement couldn't walk, locked to the earth like dock posts, cemented with barnacles. Where were these thoughts coming from? He patted his coat pocket for his notepad. Might as well capture something of worth tonight. All he'd caught was a man who was a man. "Wish I had a camera," Deputy Crawford said from the next county over, one made of embers and heat. Crawford had never given in to smartphones. He'd barely adopted a flip phone last year and was adamant about one without a built-in camera. Good thing. Clement let a shotgun slip from his hand and staked the ground. It served him better as a cane now, the stock cold despite its grip, despite the fire. How long would it burn? He burn. He'd watched a movie about the witch trials about a month ago. Jeannie loved horror movies. He hated them, but he supposed the vows he'd said at the altar 25 years ago included watching a horror movie to keep his wife happy every now and again. Maybe it had been the Lord telling him something, an omen of some kind, a warning. The road you're headed on only leads to hell. Hell, yes, he deserved it. Clement grimaced, wanted to ask forgiveness, but couldn't bring himself to look at the sky, because that's where the Lord was, not within, as Pastor Downey liked to say. The hearts of men were no home for the Lord. A pop broke the stillness. Then Crawford's laugh broke that. "Think his heart burst," he said. "Could have been his head, empty of everything but sour farts. Hey, you hear that stuff about cow farts ruining the environment?" Clement flinched at the squad car's red laser. It had found him. "Hey, Clement, ready for another?" "Clement?" Crawford said. "Crawford?" "Yeah." "Please be quiet." Clement kept the fucks to himself. He'd sinned enough tonight, but sinning is all he could do anymore, and there were yet sins to be done. Boots shoveled dirt behind Clement with the sound of sandpaper on skin. Crawford was ready for the other one. The car door opened, driver's side, with that creak that sounded all too like the oiled pews under his backside Sunday morning. It was Friday. He had a day to figure out what Sunday would be like after all this. How long would they wait for? "You gonna give me a hand or what?" Crawford called. Clement somehow turned his head to see that portly bastard he couldn't stand the sight of. Partners. No. He and Jeannie were partners. But would she still be if she found the blood under his nails that no amount of washing could clean? Probably not. But Crawford would. He lived for this stuff. Would do the work Clement couldn't, and only asked for his help when he really needed it. Like, "Now would be a good time, Madison." His first name. Would he call Clement by his middle if he had one? Clement's lungs couldn't find the sigh they so desperately needed, and he trudged to the squad car, and Crawford, who was hunched over the trunk, fighting off two polished loafers that kicked with the amount of force that duct tape ankles allowed. Crawford squealed like one of those old TV show cops. Clement supposed he was. "Say your prayers," Crawford wheezed between laughter. Clement looked up to the sky, the stars, and what he knew was beyond, looking down at him, with judging eyes that would never forget, because he had something to say. "Fuck you," Clement said. Not the poetry he'd expected, but it felt good. "You hear that, preacher?" Crawford said, and tore the man out of the trunk who had married Clement and Jeannie, forgave their lack of donation when cash was tight, prayed Jeannie to sleep every time she'd lost another baby. "He's a pastor," Clement said. "He's a fucking marshmallow is what he is, and I like mine burnt, real burnt." Clement ushered Pastor Downey down the aisle he'd carved when he'd taken Barnes to the pyre first. It was smooth and deep and worthy. Crawford threw him in because it was the part Clement couldn't handle, and Crawford went back to his spot in the front row, and Clement went back to his spot, a short walk, a stone's throw from the tree line of everlasting shadow, where he could get lost, if only he could move, where the air was clear of smoke and screams, because out here was brimming with both. The pastor did say his prayers, and shouts, and then gurgles. When that was done, the fire finished them for him. Clement found his notepad. He opened it to the light of the fire, but had nothing to write. Credit goes 100% to the artist for this first line. I don't think I would have come up with it if it weren't for the execution of the piece. As I mentioned when I was describing the artwork, the literal half tones in the smoke. And I think that really helped contribute to the overall mood and set the stage because, and I am by no means saying I'm even close to Cormac McCarthy, but I was inspired by his work in films like, in books, No Country for Old Men, and really any of his works, including The Road and Blood Meridian, because the way he writes, even though it's kind of inaccessible to a degree or overly poetic, there's just something really gripping about it. And that's what I was trying to capture here. I think the tone just screamed at me, No Country for Old Men. And I didn't quite know who was a bad guy, who was a good guy. Did these two sheriffs find a bad guy, or were they killing good guys? I don't know. That was definitely something I was playing with as I wrote. And here I'm doing a little bit of world building. I've established that our protagonist, or well, the man in the foreground, is married to a woman named Jeannie. I don't know how clear it is, but Mr. Barnes is the one burning in the fire at this moment. And what I wanted to do is try to just make this a very internal piece. I didn't want a lot of action because that's what I imagine when I look at this image is this man in the foreground, his back to what he has done, that he has a hard time dealing with it, as if maybe he's doing the dirty work no one else will do or can do. And there's a little bit of back and forth here where he's talking about calling this guy like a fucking hero, meaning, he did not scream to his death. What I tried to do as well is use these poetic thoughts, because they are coming from this man here. Have him recognize that it's out of character. So I think a lot of times when you read books that have lines like that, there's never any call out to it. It just is what it is. It's the choice of the author. It's the voice of the author. But what I wanted to do is have this man question where these interesting thoughts were coming from. And it ended up being a cool effect, because at the end, when he's considering writing down the stuff, I mentioned it early on, like, he might as well capture something of worth tonight, because the work he's doing is definitely not worth capturing. And I ended it that way, meaning, he started with all these poetic thoughts, and then at the end, he finally found his notepad, but he had nothing to say. And I needed to introduce this other fella on the side. Decided to call him Deputy Crawford. And he's going to be the opposite of Mr. Clement, as we have in the foreground, because that's how it has to work, right? You can't have two guys exactly the same. You gotta have a little bit of variety in a scene. That's gonna help provide conflict and irony, if you're lucky. And here I go on a little bit of a tangent, another internal monologue about his wife loving horror movies. And I thought that would be interesting to have this guy just really hate his work. He's not into it, or at least he's struggling with it. And I think you see that later on when he finally looks up to the sky and literally says to God, fuck you. Or he's, I should say, conceded to what his role is to be. So what I was trying to do with these internal monologues is play with that. Have him doubting what he was doing. He's looking for omens. Maybe that horror movie he watched with his wife was a bit of a warning or a foreshadowing of what was going to happen. And when I was working on this, I wasn't sure if I was going to have the action happen before or after, but as I went through the writing, I decided that the image you see before you is not what happens at the beginning, but it's what's happening toward the end, because it's just, I don't know, the staging of everything and the composition just really, it needed to have a powerful ending, I think. And really though, what happened is that this happened twice, essentially. So in the beginning, he's using the gun as a stake in the ground or as a cane, and he's facing the trees, which, are on the other side of the camera. Then I decided, once I figured out where I was going with the story, that this was not the first person they were going to kill, or the last person they were going to kill. I decided I wanted to get those two men back to their spots. And here I have Crawford, adding a little bit of goofiness to it, the old TV show cop, and Clement still, he's trying to be more reserved. He's trying to keep all of his dark thoughts or his darkness inside, not letting them manifest. Like Clement kept the fucks to himself. So he's pretty reserved up until that very end, that breaking point when he says "fuck you," because he lost. He's been fighting this entire time with what he was about to do with himself. That "fuck you" was when he lost. And at this point, I imagine that Clement still had his back to what was going on. So he's hearing all this. A car door opened, the driver's side. So he's very familiar with his vehicle and the sounds it makes, and he knows what's coming. And then here I am seeding the idea that it is the pastor who's in the back seat or the trunk saying, it sounded all too like the oiled pews under his backside Sunday morning. I guess you could take that multiple ways too, but that's what I was going for, is I was going for a little bit of foreshadowing there about who it was. And again, I'm trying to show the differences between these two men. You can see that Clement doesn't really stand or can't stand Crawford, kind of person he is, but he does understand that he needs him. He can't do this work right here. Probably not, but Crawford would. He lived for this stuff, would do the work Clement couldn't, and only asked for his help when he really needed it. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, is that, sometimes the things that you don't like don't matter because it's what you need. And that's what Clement needs, because he can't do this alone. As much as he doesn't like Crawford or doesn't like the kind of person he is, he knows that he needs him to get this job done. And why he is resigned to this job of killing these men, going above the law, even though he is the law, I'm not sure. Maybe he thinks it's his duty to clean up his town or keep it safe. And maybe the pastor was doing some bad stuff, or maybe he wasn't. Maybe Clement is a greedy bastard. And here I mentioned Crawford squealed like one of those old TV show cops. I pictured Roscoe from Dukes of Hazzard. I watched that as a kid, and that laugh just popped into my head for some reason. And so that's what I wrote. And then I went with a cliche, say your prayers, because I feel like someone that laughs like Roscoe is probably going to say something like that. He's going to get a kick out of all of this violence. And Clement is really at odds not only with himself, with his family, with his wife, but also with his religion or his beliefs, where he's constantly thinking about God and wondering, is he doing the right thing? Why is God making him do these things? Or why is he going against God to do these things? So there's multiple layers of struggle here. And it's funny, right here where I say, fuck you, Clement said, I was going to actually write out some kind of poetic saying, right? I wanted him to say something poetic because he'd been thinking all of this beautiful, flowery stuff early on. And I thought now would be the time for him to say something. But actually, I couldn't think of anything on the spot. And so as a placeholder, I just put fuck you. And it kept because I like the idea that he can think of this stuff, but when it counts and when it matters, he cannot speak it. It's almost like it's trapped inside him. And so even he has a struggle there as well. Poor Clement, I gave him a lot of burdens in this one, but I think it's interesting because you're hearing this whole story, you're reading this whole story from the perspective of Clement, and there's some purposely poetic lines in this, but he just can't bring himself to say it. But he's okay with it. It felt good. It's what he needed to say. That was the moment where he turned his back on God and, cursed him essentially for what he's making him do, or what he thinks he's making him do. And I further illustrate Crawford's stupidity by calling him a preacher, and then Clement corrects him. Again, contrast. It's all about contrast. I think that's what I was trying to do here, and that's what I always try to do, is everything needs to be different. You don't want any two people in your scene, in your entire story, to be the same, unless it's for the sake of irony, because there's going to be no conflict that arises from that. So if you are or making an example of it, I think it's okay, but always try to create irony and contrast in your scenes, with the people, with the objects, with the dialogue, with everything. That's just going to help everything feel more distinct. And not only that, it's going to help you write more conflict and more interesting scenes. And here we are wrapping up. We are taking poor Pastor Downey down to the fire to meet his maker. And I'm assembling these two characters. So Crawford, he's going back to his spot in the front row. And then Clement went back to his spot, as you see it in the image here. And again, he's bothered by this whole thing. He doesn't like it. And that was the first thing that struck me with this image, is that this character, I mean, some people may look at it and think, oh, he's a badass. He's happy with what he did. What really got to me is that he's the one not facing this act. And I think that's what makes his image so much more powerful. Because if you had both these guys looking at the fire, very, very different image, very, very different story. And I really appreciate what the artist did here. And he knows that. He knows conflict is important. And that is what he painted. So editing wasn't too bad in this. I don't think I didn't go really over. I'm actually under. And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to end that last line. And I was overall relatively happy, I think, with it. But I gave myself a little bit of breathing room. I try to finish everything. I try to hit 1,000 before I stop, but this time I didn't. Yeah, you can see my final line is incomplete. And I know what's going to happen is I'm going to go over that. So thankfully I had 20 words, or you can see now, less than that, now 12 words. And there, when I was typing past, I was thinking about writing something about the past, kind of the play on words of pastor, or the root of it. And here, once again, trying to make a final line I'm happy with, and this is more or less it. I'm one word away, and there we are. Welcome to the end, dear viewer. I am so glad you made it. Let's talk about this story, and what I liked about it, maybe what I didn't like about it, and what I learned from it. Well, as I mentioned when I was discussing the writing, it has a very Cormac McCarthy vibe to it, and just writing this thing was extremely fun. I think getting into these characters' heads, they're almost caricatures in a way, but ones that somehow feel authentic still. And I don't know why that is, considering the things they say and maybe the way they look or the way they act, but it still feels real to me. But let's talk about contrast. And I mentioned that as well, but I think here it's really important. We have these two gentlemen, Clement and Crawford, both of whom are very different from each other. We have Clement, who has this internal struggle with what he's doing and where he comes from and where he's going. And we have Crawford, who is completely happy with himself. He's staring into the fire as this man burns to death. And that provided with me an interesting setup for conflict, because as you know, if you write anything, conflict is key, right? You have to have conflict of some sort. And I had multiple layers of conflict here. I had internal conflict, I had external conflict. So you have Clement, who is dealing with his own demons, but then you have the act that he has to do, he physically does, the act of conflict, and then also dealing with Crawford, whom he doesn't like, but he knows he needs. And I think that was another interesting thing that just popped out of my head, was that, we don't always get what we want in life. We don't always get to work with who we want to work to in life. And that's what I was trying to do here, even though there is this codependent relationship between these two men. And so I think a lot of times writers think that conflict needs to be an argument. They think it needs to be a physical altercation. But really, the most powerful conflict happens in the subtext, in dialogue, in inner conflict. So I strongly urge you to explore conflict like that. Don't always get hung up on the idea that the actual conflict has to exist in the visual realm. Not only will that make your writing easier, but it will make it deeper and less repetitive. So what else? What else about this one? Well, I like the idea that he had all these poetic things going on in his head, right? The very first line was highly poetic, highly purple, very Cormac McCarthy. Not as good as Cormac McCarthy, okay? I'm not claiming anything like that. But then when it came for him to address God finally, he's looking up into the sky, and what does he say? He doesn't say any kind of impactful line. He says, fuck you. And I guess that's impactful to a degree, but what I wanted to do, and I mentioned this earlier, is I wanted him to say something profound there. And then as a placeholder, I put fuck you, and ended up loving it because I really like the idea of him not being able to conjure these thoughts, or I should say to verbalize these thoughts. And even at the very end, there's another bit there when I have a little bit of thing where he's trying to find his notepad because he says, well, I should capture something of worth tonight. But he can't find it at that moment. And then at the very end, he finally finds it, but he has nothing to write. And that's another example of subtext. I think you just always need to have subtext. Every line of dialogue. I'm reading this great book called The Story Solution. And the writer argues that, and I've heard this plenty of times before, but I think it's worth repeating, is that what is being said is not what is being meant. So every bit of dialogue is actually subtext. Sure, there's a little bit of information being communicated there, but what the characters really feel and what they're really trying to do is hidden beneath those words. And that goes for anything else. It goes for imagery in stories. It goes for the very last line where he's looking for that notepad because there's nothing worth writing. And I think you could think about that line and what the implications of that are more than the literal. At least I hope so. And it's one that I'm kind of not 100% sure what means either. And I think that's what's cool about storytelling or music or artwork is that the viewer or the consumer can create their own meaning from it. And I know a lot of people think that's bullshit and that the intention of the author or artist or musician is what it is. I'll always remember when I was in high school, I was a senior, and we were reading John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and I remember my teacher pointing out a passage of something and describing what he meant. And I asked her, I said, "How do you know that's what he meant?" And I remember her just stopping for a moment and she realized that, you know, these critics or these analysts, they don't know what these artists meant. They don't know at all what they meant. These are all interpretations. And really that's how most of art is. We very rarely get the artist to say what they mean. And I remember there was one other thing about Grapes of Wrath. There was this passage that was this really long run-on sentence. We had to rotate the reading throughout the class, and it was my shot, and I said, "How come you always mark me off when I write like that?" And my teacher told me, "Because you're not John Steinbeck." That'll always stay with me because it's kind of a lesson where, you know, you can break the rules as soon as you learn the rules, and that's what Mr. Steinbeck did. And so no matter what your English teacher says, just create art how you want to. Yes, it's very important to learn grammar and the rules of writing, but don't get discouraged if you feel like you're bending the rules a little bit for style. That's the beautiful thing with fiction. You don't have these rigid guidelines. Yes, you have like the Chicago Manual of Style and the APA and all these grammatical guides, but there's still plenty of freedom to be had there. And really, you get to choose what that is. And maybe your audience doesn't like it. In the case of Cormac McCarthy, who doesn't use dialogue quotes, he's one of the most famous living writers of our time. Now, I'm not encouraging you to do anything crazy out there. Communication is key, and getting the idea of your story across is the ultimate goal. But all I'm saying is don't worry if you don't know everything and every rule. That was my major failing, I think, early on, is when I was so worried about learning grammar and proper syntax and sentence structure and all those things. And that really just stagnated my voice, I think, until I felt a little more free and a little bit more loose. And I knew that what I was doing may be technically wrong, but it was okay. It felt good. It felt like, you know, a weight had been dropped from my shoulders and I was free to create what I wanted to create. So I don't know. Do I break all the rules? I don't know. You tell me what you think of my stories. That is up to you to decide. Love them or hate them. They are what they are. And I'm always learning. Don't ever stop. So if you'd like to support the channel, give me a like, subscribe if you like story-related content. Check out my book on Amazon and anywhere ebooks are sold. You can check out the link in the description. Come hang out with me Saturday, Sunday. I live stream here on YouTube and on Twitch around 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I don't want to lock myself in too much, but it's around that time. So keep reading, keep writing, and I will see you next week. Thanks. Bye. If you'd like to read the story in its non-video format, check the link in the description. I didn't edit anything else, promise. Thanks again.